Thanks for tuning in to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, a weekly show featuring interviews with fantastic authors sharing their personal stories on how and why they write. There's hints and tips for aspiring writers and great book reviews from top bloggers. Follow us on Twitter at JU Podcast. Right, cue the cheesy theme tune.
Put down your pen and stop your typing. Grab yourself a drink, 'cause it's Joined Up Writing.
Hello and welcome to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, where a little procrastination can go a long way. I'm Wayne Kelly, it's episode 61, and we've got a brilliant conversation today with the always interesting Melanie McGrath. Melanie talks about writing her latest psychological thriller, Give Me the Child, as well as giving loads of insight into her writing journey and process. Before we delve into all of that, I thought I'd bring you up to speed with how I've been progressing with the edit of my own crime novel, Safe Hands. You may remember last time I mentioned it that I'd been breaking down the novel into scenes and chapters using index cards, and this has been really useful from a story structure point of view, but it's also meant that in general I've had to really think about the novel, especially the characters, what they want and how they go about getting it. In particular, for me anyway, it's highlighted that one of my antagonists needs a little bit more fleshing out, as he's a bit inconsistent, shall we say, throughout the book. So, I decided to practice what I preach and employed a technique that we've talked about before on the show, doing a character monologue. And if you haven't tried that yourself, it's basically starting to write from a first-person POV of one of your characters. And in my case, my main character is written in first-person POV anyway, but I've taken the antagonist and I've done something similar and kind of got inside their head. So yeah, it's kind of riffing, getting inside their head and seeing what comes out. And once I got going, I couldn't stop and I wrote a couple of thousand words, but more importantly, I found out loads of stuff about the character that I just didn't know before I did the exercise, so it's been really worthwhile. It's given me a much tighter focus and it'll mean that I can better shape his scenes during the edit, so I'm really looking forward to cracking on with that. So if you haven't tried that yourself, do give it a go, character monologues, and let me know how you get on. And on that subject, what about your projects? Let me know what you're up to and share any hints and tips you might have, as I'm always looking for new things to try, and I'm sure many of our listeners are too. Or maybe you've got a question you'd like to ask. Either way, drop me a line, leave a comment at joinedupwriting.co.uk or tweet me at JUPodcast, or alternatively on my personal profile at Mr. Kelly2U. Let's crack on. So let's hear from today's guest, Melanie McGrath. So Melanie is an Essex girl and co-founder of Killer Women, a group of London-based crime writers who curate events, debates, talks, interviews and workshops. And she's also an award-winning writer of fiction and non-fiction. As MJ McGrath, she writes the acclaimed Edie Kiglatuk series of Arctic mysteries. She's been longlisted twice for the CWA Gold Dagger. As Melanie McGrath, she wrote the critically acclaimed and best-selling family memoir Silvertown. And as Mel McGrath, more recently, she's the author of new psychological thriller Give Me the Child. She first joined us on the show, I think, all the way back in 2015. So we started out with a bit of a catch-up. Okay, Melanie, thanks a million for coming back on. It's great to have you back on. I was just saying, I think it's been just over 2 years since you came on. So why don't we start by you giving us a little bit of an update in terms of what's been happening over the last couple of years and where you are at the moment?
Lovely to speak to you too, Wayne. It does feel like a long time ago, and it's certainly a long time in my writing life, because I've sort of changed direction. I think when we last spoke was when probably I just published the third in my Edie Kiglatuk series, which of Arctic mysteries. And I decided to stay rather closer to home. And my latest book, Give Me the Child, is a psychological thriller set in London. Really different proposition. And it's been incredibly enjoyable, actually, trying something slightly new. So that's what I've been up to, really, over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I think, I know before that you spent, obviously there's the Edie Kiglatuk series that you mentioned there, and also just in general, you're a bit of a world traveller, to say the least. There's not many places you don't seem to have been. So it probably was a bit of a relief, was it, to do something that was a little bit closer to home?
Yeah, getting on. to the point in my life where, hoofing through the jungles of Gabon, chasing in pursuit of a gorilla, it doesn't have the allure that it once did. That's all I can say. It's quite enough living in Hackney. Quite enough wildlife going on my doorstep.
So I think last time we spoke, I think actually you did, although you didn't actually name the book or anything, I think you did kind of allude to this book in sort of passing, because I think you mentioned at the time, I don't know whether you just finished it or maybe you just finished your first draft, or I'm not sure, but I think you kind of mentioned something that kind of had some element of the London riots in it. Was that the same book?
Yeah. I wanted to set a book with a backdrop of the London riots, but I was interested in exploring from as a kind of psychological perspective, not just the secrets that adults keep between each other, which I think is quite a well-covered terrain in psychological fiction, but the secrets that adults ask children to keep and what that does to children. So that was the sort of place where I started out. I think, we all use experience to inform our interests and the directions we want to go in. And my family, like many families, I think, is replete with secrets going back generations and generations and generations. And I'm only just starting to kind of unpick them and put them together. But as a kid, of course, one's asked to keep these secrets, and you don't really have a sense of the power that they have. So that was a kind of starting off point. But I was also really interested in, because I was very impacted, as I think a lot of us were, by the murder of James Bulger, and in particular, dreadful and harrowing that it was, but in particular for me, I think one of the things that stood out was that people weren't very quick to monster the killers. And of course, it's a terrible thing that they did, but without having a kind of understanding of where that might have come from. So that got me quite interested in the new field of child psychopathy, which was something that wasn't really recognised, that children could be psychopathic, until fairly recently, for the very sensible reason that you have to be very careful about putting those kind of labels on kids.
Of course, yeah.
So all those things came together, I think, where in the London riots, when I saw again these kids who were just been really stupid and got carried away and did really stupid things, had bad impulse control and were, I think, over-influenced by consumer society that tells them if they get the next pair of Nikes or whatever it is, then they're cool and they'll be accepted. And the way that we had created a whole generation we criminalised, a whole generation in London. What that did to kids, it kind of took away their hope, took away their futures. So, I got very interested in exploring those kinds of themes, but of course, themes aren't a story. So I started with a couple, Kat and Tom, who Kat is of mixed heritage, comes from tough estate background in South London. Tom is white, much more middle class. Tom's a games developer. And Kat has made good and has gone out and become a rather successful neuropsychiatrist specialising in new research into child personality disorders. And I set the cat among the pigeons, which,
pardon the pun,
all crime fiction, all psychological fiction has to do.
Yeah.
I had them. They have a daughter called Freya, who's 11 years old, and they're all in bed, fast asleep one night. Marriage is fine, a little rough around the edges, a bit threadbare, but, a bit like a baggy old duvet cover, but, still does the job. So they're in bed, they're all asleep, and the doorbell rings in the middle of the night. And as we all know, that's never a good thing.
No.
Kat and Tom go down, and at the door there is a policewoman, a social worker, and another little 11-year-old girl who, as it turns out, has lost her mother and is claiming to be the love child of Tom. Mm-hmm. And the action moves from there, and safe to say, this being psychological fiction, nothing is as it seems. Mm-hmm. Is this new introduction to the household, Ruby, really Tom's child or not? Does she have the kind of intentions that she says she has? How about this mother who supposedly died? Did she really die, and in what kind of circumstances? So it's one of those psychological fictions where nothing is as it seems, and everyone might or might not be lying, not least to themselves. Kat has a particular difficulty in that she suffered, during her first pregnancy, she suffered from psychoses, and ever after has not been able to get out from under that. Mm-hmm. And I think that's actually, when I was writing the book, something really amazing happened to me, which was almost like life imitating art, if you can call what I was doing art. And it was that I discovered after 25 years, and I discovered it completely by accident in a way I won't tell you about because we don't have the time, that I had been diagnosed 25 years ago with a psychiatric disorder that no one had ever told me about, but was in my medical records and had been available to anyone who looked at my medical records, so any doctors, but also, potentially insurance companies and mortgage people and so on, for 25 years without my knowing. So that sense of having been labelled in a way, which I think happens to particularly women quite a lot who've had episodes of mental illness. They can't get out from under it. You're always going to be vulnerable, not only to gaslighting from other people, but also to feeling that you can't trust yourself. Mm-hmm. So she's a woman who her experience tells her that she can trust herself, but this prior episode tells her that she might not be right. So all manner of things happen, not least the riots kicking off in the middle of all of this. And it's up to Kat to decide which version of the truth is the right version of the truth. And if she gets it wrong, she potentially will lose a great deal. And I'll leave it at that.
Without any more spoilers, it sounds great. And as you say, I mean, I did actually read the incident that you talked about. I know you did an article fairly recently about the incident that happened to yourself with your misdiagnosis, or whatever you want to call it, your hidden diagnosis, I guess it was, really, because you didn't know anything about it. So presumably, when you found that out, were you quite a long way? Had you written the novel already, or was that during the writing of it when you found that out about your diagnosis?
I was halfway through, and it was one of those really odd experiences, because I was writing about a character who had the same experience as me, or a similar experience to me, but I didn't know about it. So it was almost as if, I'd plucked it out of the air somewhere.
It's almost like you suspected it in your subconscious or something, and it came out when you were writing.
Yeah, maybe. Yes, I mean, all kinds of odd things happen, I think, when you're writing and you're tapping into your subconscious and things that you're not kind of really conscious, obviously not consciously aware of. So yeah, it was a very strange, but it made me realise it was a book that I needed to write. Because
absolutely.
I don't have an 11-year-old daughter, and I certainly hope my partner doesn't have one. If he hasn't told me about it.
Let's hope too much of the rest of the book doesn't come true. But And that idea, that aside, obviously, is that kind of a typical example of how how things tend to form for you, in terms of it's sort of a confluence of, two or more ideas that are kind of bubbling away in the background that kind of overlap and then become a story? Is it a case that you're attracted to those themes or ideas or whatever you want to call them, you're interested in them, and then you think, right, I need to write a story that kind of encompasses those themes? Or is it like you've just got that story and you think, hang on, I could take that story and kind of match it with those are the things that I'm interested in, that background or, the backdrop or whatever it might be?
I think those things kind of grow together organically, actually. Mm-hmm. And I think there are certain themes in your life that just keep coming up over and over and over again. And at some point they bubble up and you know that it's the right time to write about them somehow. Mm-hmm. I mean, the book I'm working on at the moment is about the point where very close friendships that are forged in early adulthood, so at university in this case, mm-hmm. 4 friends at university, the point at which that friendship becomes toxic without them really knowing that that's happened. Yeah. And I think a lot of us sort of experience that, and you can hang on to a friendship because it's an old friendship and because it has meant a lot to you in the past, mm-hmm. long after its sell-by date. And mm-hmm. that was something that had happened to me fairly recently. And an old friend kept getting in touch and then not turning up for, when we fixed up to meet, not turning up, and then being full of apologies and so on and so forth. And after a couple of years of this, I just thought, you know what, I've come to the end with this. Yeah. But it's long. So I was very interested in that idea of toxic friendships and the damage they can do before.
It can take a long time to kind of shake off that kind of baggage and those behaviours, can't it? Because, as you say, they form a really formative, important part of your, growing up and your maturity. And obviously, you've changed a lot since the time that you were there, and as has the other person. But those initial, the way that it was set up at the beginning, it's hard to shake that off, particularly with relationships from that time in your life. I think, and you cling on to them partly because they're reminders of a very, very intense time in your life, and because you're all kind of learning how to be adults together and all those exciting things. And you don't realise the degree to which they're sort of dripping away at your self-confidence or your self-esteem or your sense of yourself or whatever it is. So that forms the theme of the next book, which I'm sort of in the middle of doing. And I didn't consciously think, I want to write about this theme. It was just this theme kept knocking on the door of my conscience, my consciousness at that point. And that's the point at which I then create the characters that are going to allow me to, create a story and allow me to explore that through them. It's great. It's a great position to be in, isn't it? It's one of the joys of being a writer, I guess.
Oh yeah, it's fantastic. You get to explore all your hang-ups and your baggage, but you do it in the safety of other people's characters. It's brilliant.
I mean, do you look? I mean, joking aside, I mean, have you ever looked at writing as kind of a form of therapy? I mean, I know it can literally be a form of therapy. One of the guests that's coming on in an upcoming show, his writing career actually came out of therapy. He was actually, as part of his therapy process, his therapist actually encouraged him to write down his experiences, his traumatic experiences, and from that he ended up becoming a writer, if you like. He hadn't really written before or even thought about being a writer, but it came out of that. But what about for you? Do you ever find that to be the case? Is it a therapeutic exercise?
No, I would never think of it in that way. I strive to tell a story, and the best story I can possibly tell. I think there are themes, if you're a writer, that are often to do with unresolved things in your childhood that come up over and over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. And certainly sort of family secrets is one of them for me. Home, the idea of home, because we moved around all the time when I was a kid. So that comes up a lot, what constitutes home and how you feel safe at home and those kinds of things. So I think those those are kind of the backdrop to your creative life. But I would never say, I mean, nothing except the story gets resolved when I write something. I think, I mean, I've had therapy, and I think therapy is really useful for you to, as a writer, for you to be able to know and explore what the themes are that you constantly return to and why you return to them. But for me, writing is about telling a story, about creating characters, about putting them in a difficult situation and seeing what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on that subject, because it's not something that we particularly explored last time we had a chat, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you became a writer in the first place? I know you've kind of got a bit of a background in journalism, but was it always your plan to write fiction?
I don't know how to answer that really, because I think as my parents, I was brought up middle class, but my parents come from the East End of London. They're not the sort of people who would naturally produce a writer, or at least that's what I thought. So growing up, I was an avid reader. And my parents definitely encouraged that. My mother had this very strange experience because she was evacuated during the war, and then she got TB, and so she ended up spending 6-7 years, all her teenage years, really, in a sanatorium, in a TB sanatorium, and she just read and read and read and read, and in a way, she read herself out of her background, out of her sort of humble origins.
Yeah.
So reading was a really important part of my growing up, but I don't think I'd ever thought that people like me could be writers. So it took me a long time to own that, if you like. I started writing nonfiction and journalism, and I still write nonfiction. I've just finished a nonfiction book. So I write, that's my kind of other, I'm in my other mode. I write a lot about social history in London, particularly, because that's where my family come from. And I like to give a voice to people who are not represented in the history books. So I still keep my hand in, and it's a nice, it's a great kind of break. It's a great thing to do in between doing the fiction, because I get to go out and actually talk to real people and hear their stories and kind of weave that into a narrative. It's a very different process from fiction, where I think it's rather like, if you think of a sculpture, writing non-fiction, or the kind of non-fiction that I do, is rather like being given a huge lump of clay and having to shape it into something, chipping away bits of it by removing
some kind of narrative emerges.
Yeah. Whereas I think fiction is the opposite. Skill, that it's a skill of creating something from the ground up that has a shape right from the start, even if that shape isn't entirely clear and it's going to change. So it's a different way of working, but I find both of them work together really well.
So at what point did you decide you were going to go into journalism, though? Because presumably you studied, or at some point you decided to direct your studies in that direction, or you thought, hang on, yeah, I could write for a living in some shape or form. Was that quite an early decision, or was it something like a lot of people where you just sort of fell into it, something that you enjoyed?
I fell into it, really. I wrote my first non-fiction book, and I think what spurred me to do that, and what spurred me to kind of own the idea that I could be a writer, was the very tragic and early death of my dad when I was in my early mid-20s. And I suddenly felt that thing that most people in their 20s don't feel, that I was sort of next in line, if you like.
Mortality, yeah.
The sting of mortality, and all those cliches, life is not a rehearsal, and all of that. Sure, yeah. So I'm not sure that I'd have had the confidence, or I would have been propelled into doing it if that hadn't happened. But because it happened, and because it left me flailing and feeling like I didn't know what to do. I'd come to a crossroads in my life. That it was a kind of push me, pull you thing, really. I always knew I wanted to write at some point, and it gave me the excuse to go out and do it. My life had just been, a bomb had just been thrown into my life, and I felt at the time that I didn't have anything to lose. So I'm not sure that I'd have been courageous enough to do it if that hadn't happened. And I'm sorry, desperate that it did happen. But
of course,
for me, it was also quite liberating, I have to say. Or at least, it made me grasp reality and really accept the fact that writing was what I wanted to do. So I went and wrote my first book, Motel Nirvana, which was a sort of travel memoir book.
Yeah.
It was really about getting over grief. And again, it wasn't therapeutic. I didn't come out feeling better.
No.
I came out having written a particular story, and it won a very nice literary prize. And
I saw that, yeah.
That gave me the confidence to go on. So that's how my writing life began, really.
Yeah, absolutely. So I saw that. So with the journey to publication, specifically with that book, I mean, did you just, so you literally went off and you just, you wrote, I mean, I know it's kind of part travel log and that book is, and you kind of went off and you wrote it, and then did you ship it around publishers? How did you go about actually getting that first book published? What kind of, was that a long process? How did that go?
Well, I'm a great advocate in the idea that you can fake it till you make it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I knew I was going to write it, and I wrote to a number of editors. I didn't have an agent, and I wrote to a number of editors just out of the Writers and Artists Yearbook.
And query letters,
saying, enclosing a little synopsis and saying, I'm going to write this whether you commission it or not. Mm-hmm. If you don't commission it now, you're going to have to pay a lot more for it.
Bravado, I love it.
Yeah, it was all nonsense. I was quaking in my boots. But someone, Stuart Prophet, who is now a Penguin, I believe, was generous enough to ask me to come and see him, and I came and went and saw him, and I gave the same spiel, and he must have thought, what have we got here? But anyway, he was nice enough. He didn't give me very much money to do it, but he gave me just enough money so that I could sponsor myself through the period of, so I could go part-time with the work I was doing and sponsor myself through the period of writing it. Mm-hmm. And it was an agonizing time. I think it was before there were, I think the UEA writers, MA, creative writing MA existed, but I don't think anything else did. Mm-hmm. And you couldn't go to, there were writing groups here and there, but there was nowhere you could go to kind of learn the craft of creative writing. And I teach a lot of creative writing now, and I wish that I had had that resource 22 years ago when I started out, because I don't think you can teach anyone to be a great writer, but you can teach them confidence. You can teach them how to express themselves in a way that reaches other people. What you can't teach them is to have something to say. There are plenty of us who've got something to say and don't quite know how to say it or structure it. So it was a very painful process, and I learnt the hard way, as they say at the coalface. And I wouldn't. I think now, if I were advising someone who wanted to write, I would suggest that they sign up for a creative writing course, and even if they don't feel that it end up not feeling it's the one for them, it gives you confidence. You're around other people. You get the sense that there's no one way of doing things. There's no one key that you can get cut that is going to open the door to bestsellerdom and a long career writing, or even to make writing easy. Writing isn't easy. I don't find writing any easier now than I did 22 years ago. I'm just much more confident about what I'm good at and what I'm not good at.
You just know yourself a little bit better.
as a writer, and I know myself sufficiently well to know that when I'm edited, I'm fairly confident about where the editors write, which they are most of the time, and where to fight my battles. So I think you can gain that confidence more quickly than I did by setting yourself up on a course or a series of courses.
That's good advice. Well, I mean, something else that strikes me when you look at your body of work, and it's a considerable body of work, you know, you've got such a wide range of writing, right from, I mean, you mentioned you kind of did the kind of travel log type things. You've got family memoir, which you've kind of alluded to earlier on, talking about your family, and I think Silvertown was one of the first ones that you did that was kind of in that that kind of mode. And in today's kind of world of pigeonholing and categorizing, for writers like you that kind of write across such a wide range of genres and fiction and non-fiction, how important do you think it is to kind of think about how you brand yourself from genre to genre? I notice, I don't know whether this is something that's going to continue, but I know over the time you've been writing, you've written under Melanie McGrath, you've written under MJ McGrath and Mel McGrath. And is that a conscious thing that you're kind of involved in? Is it something that your publishers suggest? And kind of, you know, how much kind of thinking do you put into that? Or is it literally just, I just want people to know that this is a different genre to what I last wrote in or whatever?
I think it's probably quite clear from what you've said that I've got a giant identity crisis. And I'd have been much better off and probably had a lot more money if I just stuck to being one person as a writer. But I don't seem to be able to do that. I think branding is something that really wasn't a thing when I first started out, and the publishing industry has changed so enormously in the 20 years that I've been writing. And to be absolutely honest, I wouldn't advise any writer starting out to do what I've done, because you have to kind of reinvent yourself every time. You have to reestablish an audience every time. You have to reestablish a readership. And I think that had I not started out so long ago, I think probably publishers wouldn't have had the patience with me that they've had, because the market is now very crowded and it's very competitive, and you do need to be more strategic and think about things like branding. But I also think in order to have a lengthy career, you know, books are publishers publish into fashions, and in order to have a lengthy career, you also need to have flexibility. You also need to be able to change the mode that you write in according to what's popular at the moment and what's fashionable. I mean, having said that, I never go out. I never seek to write something in order to attract an audience. I write things that I believe in. And I think if you write something thinking, oh, this is just like X, which did brilliantly, then you're sunk.
Well, yeah, because apart from anything else, by the time, you know as well as I do, that by the time, even if you're a quick writer, by the time you've actually finished writing that idea that might be popular at the moment, the chances are it won't be popular by the time it's time for your book to be released. Even on a practical basis, regardless of the fact that it's probably not going to be your best work either.
That's right. And I think you've got to believe in what you do.
Completely,
and that's why I come back to, you know, knowing yourself well enough to know the things that you're obsessed by, because you can think of, I mean, any number of great ideas. I mean, I wouldn't say they're necessarily great, but ideas come to me all the time, and I think, oh, that's interesting. But it's not interesting enough for me to want to invest a year of my life and my time and my career in. And it's a mistake that a lot of new writers make, of thinking that they can write into the market. You have to write with a sense of knowing what the market is and an eye to the market. But if you write into the market, then as so often with beginner writers, they get to chapter 4 and they run out of steam because they don't actually believe in what they're writing, because it doesn't, I mean, it has to, at some level, it has to kind of obsess you. Because you're going to be
Spending a lot of time on it.
Yeah, I'm working so intensely at it. And I think readers can tell if you're bored with something, then how can you expect to maintain the interest of readers? So I plan my books, particularly the fiction. I plan very, I think in crime you have to hit certain plot points. Mm-hmm. So I plan very carefully, but I never keep to the plan. And quite often the person who I think committed some malfeasance or other turns out not to be the person. Mm-hmm. Because if I can't surprise myself, then how can I surprise a reader? So I think there are all those things going on in your head, but it can never be a cynical enterprise, because you're not going to, your editor is going to pick that up immediately, an agent's going to pick that up. You have to really want it and really believe in the story that you've got to tell, and really believe somehow that it needs to be told. I mean, it's a strange thing, because a story will come to you. Stories will come to you that feel sort of flabby, mm-hmm. and that don't need to be told mm-hmm. by you at that particular time, and then can re-emerge later. Sometimes, I've been writing now professionally for 22 years. They can sometimes emerge years later.
Yeah.
And
nothing is wasted.
It's time. No, nothing is wasted. As all writers tell ourselves when we're going through, a horrible divorce or some kind of grim illness or something, it's not wasted.
Okay, that's a good time to take a very quick break, just to remind you that we're still looking for more book bloggers to send us their reviews for Book Bloggers Corner. And yes, it's my weekly stab of your conscience, just to remind you to leave us a quick review on iTunes. It literally takes less than a minute to either leave us a rating or a review, and it massively improves our chances of being discovered by new listeners, which is what we're all about, trying to get joined up with new writers. But if you can't find the time to do that, that's okay as well. How about you just tell at least one of your friends, or share the show on one of your social media profiles? That would be brilliant as well. One more thing before we get back to the chat with Mel, and that's to give you a bit of a heads up about some of the guests we've got lined up for the next couple of months. I've already recorded interviews with Joanna Penn, who's on the show sometime in November, as well as Matt Johnson, William Shaw, Rachel Amphlett, Kate Medina and Thomas Mogford. And I've also got interviews scheduled with Claire Fuller, Bonnie McBird and A.A. Dand. So a ton of brilliant writers. It's been fascinating talking to them, and I hope you found them as interesting and inspiring as I have. But if you want to suggest other guests, or maybe you think you're a potential guest, maybe you're a writer, a publisher, an agent or an editor, and you'd like to come on for a chat, that'd be brilliant as well. So please get in touch either on Twitter, through the website or on Facebook. Right, let's get back to the chat with Melanie, who's talking now about her excellent Edie Kiglatuk series of books. Obviously, you had great success with your Edie Kiglatuk series of books, which we mentioned at the top of the show. So for people that don't know, just remind us what they are, and also if you've got any more plans to write any more in the series.
Okay, well, it is a series, it's a trilogy at the moment, and one of the reasons that I haven't written a fourth book is that the three books are at the moment being developed for TV in Canada. Whether that actually will happen or not, I'm not sure. But it seemed like a good time to call a break. And I also wanted to write I enjoy challenging myself. So I wanted to write in another mode. I wanted to write a psychological fiction. And as I've been saying, some things sort of bubble up and demand to be written. So that's why Give Me the Child kind of intervened. But it's a series of a trilogy set in high Arctic. The protagonist, Edie Kiglatuk, is half Inuit and half white. And so she's negotiating. It's a culture clash series, really. She's negotiating being half of one thing and half of another thing and not belonging anywhere. She's the ultimate outsider. She's also a woman in which in a
very male-dominated society.
Yeah, in a very male-dominated society. The Arctic itself is probably the only character with which she has a sort of healthy, non-dysfunctional relationship. In fact, she loves the Arctic, and the Arctic loves her and is good to her insofar as the Arctic is good to anyone. And I travelled to the Arctic as a journalist, and I saw all kinds of really interesting stories that weren't being told, either because people didn't get up there very much, or because they just, the Arctic is changing incredibly fast, and it's not what people think it is. It's much more populated. There's much more. There are lots and lots of big kind of fault lines. Not just global warming, but and all that brings. But in terms of the indigenous people having to adjust themselves very, very rapidly to very expanding populations, to white people coming in, particularly white men coming in on short-term contracts and being able to get away with all kinds of things. The crime rate up there is akin to somewhere like Mexico or South Africa. Huge homicide rates, which in real life almost never get investigated. And the time I was there, I think there was one investigator for Arctic Canada and Alaska, which is sort of the size of, say, India. So, I wanted my outsider, Edie Kiglatuk, my protagonist, to be an amateur, detective, although she has a sidekick who is Derek Palliser, who's part of the native police service there, but incredibly under-resourced. He's also secretly prefers keeping lemmings to investigating crime. He's a big lemming fan. And so it's a kind of, it has sort of blackly comic moments, and of course I work a lot with the landscape, but also in the way that the culture prevents crimes being talked about or investigated. So, for example, it's very difficult to get people up there to talk about the dead because it's taboo. So they feel that the spirits will, if you talk about them, the spirits won't be able to go into the spirit world. They'll stay, in some kind of half space. So I really enjoyed working with that. So that was the lovely challenge for me as a writer, was working out all the ways in which the environment foxes Edie, and the ways in which she outfoxes the environment. So that
constant battle.
Yeah, but she's a doughty type, and she wins through. She doesn't take any prisoners. I think it's fair to say she's a tough woman. She's small, but she's tough. And she was actually inspired by someone I met up there who was an ex-polar bear hunter, who was about 5 foot tall, I would say, an Inuit woman, was hired by these incredibly macho guys who do expeditions to the North Pole, and they hired this tiny little woman to keep them safe from polar bears, because she can smell them before you or I would be able to. She can detect their paw prints before you and I would be able to. She knows their behaviour, so she was the inspiration. When I came back from the Arctic, I thought, I really want to write this. I really want to write a character who seems to be very vulnerable and an outsider, but who has so much specialist knowledge that she can really hold her own and some. It was the series is published in, I think it's 18 languages, and 2 of the 3 books were longlisted for the CWA Gold Dagger, which was fantastic for me because that was my kind of, I was just out of the gate as a fiction writer.
You're arriving, yeah.
And I'd love to see her getting into more scrapes. God knows she's very good at that.
So she's obviously very much alive in your subconscious, and you're waiting for the next excuse to write the next book.
Oh yeah, and I know what it's going to be. I know the scrape I'm going to get her into as well, and it's one that she hasn't encountered. And it actually, for all her knowledge of the environment, it's not going to get her out of this particular scrape. So I'm really setting the bar high for her for the next one. And it's just, if only you could write a book in a couple of days.
Yeah, just turn it out. Well, hopefully, with fingers crossed, it could be, as you say, it's only in development at the moment, but and we know how that can go. But hopefully, it could be making its way onto the TV in some way, shape, or form. Well,
I'd love to see that. I think, and I'd love Rooney Mara to play Edie.
Perfect, yeah.
If she listens to your podcast, Rooney, get in touch.
Oh yeah, she's a huge fan, Mel. Yeah, she's a huge fan of this podcast. If you are listening, then let me know if you are a fan, Rooney. That'd be great. But that sounds brilliant. Well, I look forward to seeing the next one when it comes out. And Give Me the Child is out at the minute. So what is your, well, you've kind of hinted at it, but so what's your next book? Obviously, Give Me the Child has only just come out, hasn't it? Just tell people where they can find that for a start.
It has. It's out in hardcover, but I believe it's at a rather good price on Amazon. And also, obviously, in all your good bookshops, and in a couple of supermarkets as well.
Oh, brilliant!
And just getting great reviews, which I'm incredibly pleased about. The Financial Times said it was triumph, and The Sun said it was incredibly dark, compelling, and gripping. So I feel I've sort of
covering. I'm going to say you're covering all the whole spectrum there, aren't you?
Which I'm particularly proud about. But it seems that people have found it a lot of different kinds of people seem to have found something in it that grips them and speaks to them, which is great. So that is just out a couple of weeks ago. And I am now working on, as I said, another standalone psychological thriller about 4 friends who witness something and months later that is going to come back to haunt them, and they're drawn together by what I can only describe as a very dark habit.
Sounds interesting. And what's the sort of timescale for that? Is that next year sometime, or?
I hope next year, yes. I'm writing really, really fast, Wayne.
So yeah, if your editor's listening, she's writing. Yeah. She's working very hard. Okay, well, no, brilliant.
I'm not talking to you. I'm slaving over a hot keyboard.
Absolutely. Well, you get in trouble either way, because if you're not promoting your book, then they want you to be working on it. So you know as well as I do, you need to be doing both things, really.
Yeah, well, between you and me, I've been writing as I've been speaking.
Absolutely. I'd expect nothing less.
No, I've been all yours, Wayne.
So, just remind people where they can find stuff about you online, on Twitter and your website.
Well, I'm at www.melaniemcgrath.com. My website, it is up to date, but it's not a very joyous experience, I have to say, because I'm a bit rubbish at doing all that stuff. But I'm on Twitter at McGrathMJ. Please come and say hello, and Facebook too. You can also reach me via Killer Women, which is a group of 20. There are now 21 of us, I think. Women crime writers, which I co-founded, a couple of years ago now, and we had our first festival last year, which got onto the BBC, no less.
Brilliant.
And we're doing something slightly different this year, but if life should take you to London at the end weekend of October and you feel you've got the next crime bestseller in you, we're doing a weekend of workshops and craft events and meet and greets with publishers and agents, and generally sort of finding out more about the business and how to how to structure your crime novel and how to get it out there and get it to the best audience.
Sounds brilliant.
So,
I'll make a mention of that in the show notes as well then. That's excellent.
Thank you. Thanks. And that's www.killerwomen.org.
Nice and easy to remember. Well, thank you very much for coming along and chatting to me. I know you're going to stay around just very briefly for the epilogue, and we're going to have got one more little question, one little more topic I wanted to speak to you about, something that you touched on earlier actually to do with teaching. But other than that, Melanie McGrath, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Wayne. It's been such a pleasure.
Okay, there you go. That pretty much wraps up this week's show. Thanks again to Melanie McGrath, and if you haven't checked out Melanie's work, I suggest you do so. Also, look out for Melanie's bonus episode next week, which will be the epilogue, of course, where she'll be talking a little bit more about creative writing courses and some of her experience specifically with that. Just a quick reminder as well, don't forget you can get in touch with us through all the usual places. You can find us on Twitter at JU Podcast, on Facebook, Joined Up Writing Podcast, and also the web, joinedupwriting.co.uk. And you can find me personally on Twitter at Mr. Kelly to you. Other than that, that pretty much wraps up this week. So thanks for listening to the Joined Up Writing Podcast. Happy writing and reading, and I'll see you next time.